The years of World War II also brought the beginning of more permanent changes to Louisiana. These changes are most graphically illustrated by the experience of two groups, African Americans and women, both of which edged closer towards equal treatment during the war. African Americans at the beginning of World War II still experienced the inequality which had historically dominated race relations in the United States since the imposition of Jim Crow segregation laws during the late 19th century. Many students of the civil rights movement see the years of World War II as the turning point at which many African Americans decided not to accept continued unequal treatment without protest.
So you really start to see momentum shifting in that direction amongst the individuals within the African American community, but you also see the federal government as well beginning to respond to the needs of the nation's black citizens, whereas before the government tended to take a more standoff approach. The classic example of this is the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which emerges in 1940 in part because Asa Philip Randolph, who is the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, he was going to organize this March on Washington. And the whole purpose of it was to raise awareness that African Americans in the North and the South are being denied access to employment in the defense industry. So Franklin Roosevelt, in order to prevent that March in Washington from actually taking place, cuts a deal with A. Philip Randolph. So he sits down with Randolph and promises him that by executive order, I will create the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which will, prohibit any further defense contracts from being issued unless there are non-discrimination clauses added to it.
The shortage of labor caused by the war provided opportunities for African American workers to enter new fields of work and establish a recognized position before the post-war slump forced workers back out of jobs.
So wages went up because of the demand. We had a labor shortage, which meant that black people found jobs in areas where they were competing with lesser paid whites previously. So there were a lot of openings available.
African Americans often found their first employment in the shipyards, which pioneered their employment in many occupations. They remained in a segregated society, however. In New Orleans, for example, the Longshoremen's Union maintained two units, Local 1418 with about 700 white members and Local 1419 with about 2,100 African American members.
The attitude of the unions, which continued to reject skilled black workers, and therefore they were excluded from the workplace on that basis, since so many of the craft unions dominated, for example, the shipyards in the area.
African Americans responded to the stirrings of patriotism, as did other Americans, recognizing, however, that contributions to the war effort could also be used in future bids for equality. These efforts received some recognition from within the white establishment. The Monroe News-Star remarked in 1941 that it is wise and right that both in the military services and in defense industries, broadening opportunities should be opening up for Americans of colored blood. Other institutions of the white establishment looked less benignly on the activities and opportunities. The Town Talk suspected that fifth columnists were at work within the African American population, spreading theories of Nazism. The Shreveport Chamber of Commerce maintained that the federal government's Fair Employment Practices Commission had created ill will between races.
Companies up in Shreveport in Louisiana, there were several defense entities that decided, well, we're not going to abide by the spirit of the FEPC, and we're going to try to get these government contracts anyhow. And in essence, what happened was they were just shut out of the federal revenue, and there was thousands of dollars lost to places like Shreveport in the South, which refused to open up their employment to black workers.
Southerners learned that the federal government had a new commitment to equality, and that it had no hesitation to enforce that commitment by granting or withholding federal funds. Shreveport, for example, lost $67,000 in federal funds for construction of a health center because the city administration refused to agree to a requirement that 12% of the unskilled workers on the job be African American. Mayor Sam Caldwell's reaction to that news illustrates the price many white Southerners were willing to pay for their traditional social practices. "We have lost the health center," he remarked, "but we have retained our respect in white supremacy. We are not going to be bribed by federal funds to accept the Negro as our political or social equal." Louisiana's African Americans also began to regain a political voice that had been virtually silent since disfranchisement in 1898. In 1944, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the Smith versus Allwright case that the Texas system of all-white Democratic Party primaries was unconstitutional.
The 15th Amendment was supposed to guarantee the right for African Americans or states could not discriminate against African Americans to vote. But early on in 1876 in U.S. versus Reese, the Supreme Court limited Congress's ability to enforce the 15th Amendment. So after that, states, primarily Southern but not exclusively, began to adopt various techniques, tricks to prevent African Americans from voting. These ranged from poll taxes to literacy tests, but those were problematic because they also excluded white voters as well. So states began to adopt what was known as the white primary. Texas was the state that initiated it, which was the argument that the general election, anybody could vote, but in the Democratic primary, only whites could vote.
Because Louisiana used essentially the same manner of denying the franchise to African Americans, its political system had to accommodate the ruling as well.
By using the white primary, that could be a group action, so you effectively excluded whole groups of people. You didn't have to individually single out individuals to prevent them from voting. You would just prevent all African Americans from participating in the Democratic primary. This was going to then force Southern states to adopt these individual exclusionary techniques. And really it signals the beginning of the end.
Registration of African American voters proceeded slowly, however. Rapides Parish Registrar of Voters P.T. Hayworth reported in August 1944 that 17 African Americans had registered to vote in the parish. He remarked that no African Americans had been registered to vote in the parish for at least 20 years, and that he had disqualified about as many as he had registered because they could still not fill out the voter's registration form intelligently, to use his word. Merle S. Weigel, Assistant Registrar of Voters in Tangipahoa Parish, reported in the same month that no African Americans had attempted to register there, but that we don't intend to let any register, but don't want any trouble about it. It was not until October 1964 that every parish in the state had at least one African American voter. Louisiana's major racial disruption occurred during January 1942 in Alexandria. The Lee Street riot began after a patrol of about 60 white military policemen entered the traditionally African American neighborhood on Lee Street to arrest an African American soldier for disorderly conduct. Accounts indicate that the ensuing melee left businesses along several blocks of Lee Street damaged and approximately 28 African American soldiers hurt, including 3 to 5 who were shot and seriously wounded. Information about the Lee Street riot is difficult to obtain, but there are indications that the casualty list was probably much higher.
Great. My dad was stationed here at Camp Claiborne back in the 40s when supposedly this Lee Street riot occurred. Mm-hmm. He happened to be on Lee Street the night of the riot. And the story that he tells, the whole thing began with a black soldier being arrested for having whistled at a white woman. And from there, things just began to escalate. The police arrested the black soldier and other black soldiers who were on Lee Street, because this was the place where the black soldiers would congregate, on their off-duty time. So they began to gather around the policeman, and then it's my understanding from Dad that reinforcement came. And things just escalated from that particular point, to the point of where other police officers were called to the Lee Street area, and they began to walk down the street, just indiscriminately shooting, at the soldiers who were congregated on Lee Street. And Dad was very reluctant to really talk about this. Apparently it was a traumatic experience for him. He said the only thing that he believes that saved his life was the fact that someone touched him on his shoulder and pulled him inside of one of the restaurants there on Lee Street. Other than that, he probably would have been killed. Now, story has it that not very many people were injured that night. But from conversations with my dad, who again was there that night, he is saying that there were hundreds of people, hundreds of black soldiers that were killed that night, and that they were taken out of town on railroad cars because the railroad was not that far up Lee Street. So those bodies were taken out of Alexandria on those railroad cars. Some also indicate that some of the soldiers who were killed that night are actually buried in the Lee Street area. There is a Union Baptist Church on Lee Street, and in conversations with some other people in the community, it is alleged that there are actually people buried under that church. Now, I don't know if that's true. There's also a funeral home there, Good Shepherd Funeral Home, that's on Lee Street, and allegedly there are bodies that are buried under that funeral home. Now, whether or not all of that is true, I don't know.
Another traditionally circumscribed group began edging closer to the mainstream of American life during World War II. Women, customarily relegated to civil pursuits, housework, or women's jobs in the workplace, used the labor shortage caused by the war just as African Americans did to stake a claim on non-traditional forms of employment. Women became stockboard markers at the New Orleans office of Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Finner, and Bean. They ran parking lots, drove taxi cabs, welded and repaired aircraft, delivered newspapers, worked in machine shops, managed stores, and performed a myriad of other jobs, often replacing men who had gone to war. In addition, more than 400 Louisiana women applied to the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps Officer School during the first week after the government began accepting applications in 1942.
We also, in doing a lot of the interviews that we do now, are finding lots of WACs, Women Army Corps volunteers. Many women from the Florida parishes served as well. They contributed not just in terms of battlefield and services to the Army itself, but in terms of medical services, in different types of technical expertise.
An expanded role for women in society did not sit well with all Louisianians, however. Louisiana legislators objected to a bill introduced in 1942 that would have eliminated the requirement that women had to register separately for jury duty. The Louisiana Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs favored the bill, but it went down in defeat. Many legislators obviously agreed with the anonymous representative who maintained that we have already gone too far in abandoning our Southern rights, and another who maintained that women jurors sometimes would be required to hear unsavory testimony. The Baton Rouge Morning Advocate, however, commented on the defeat of the bill that we'll have more of this sadly comic business as long as the idea persists that women are, after all, much inferior to men and don't deserve an opportunity to prove that the holders of these opinions are wrong. Women retreated somewhat from their wartime achievements during the late 1940s and 1950s, just as did African Americans. But these two groups did not forget their wartime foray into prosperity and equality.
And Dad, after his service in the Army, of course, he was from Mississippi originally and decided to live here in Louisiana. And he got into politics, and he served as a councilman in the town of Boyce for 32 years, after that. So he became very involved in church work, and that experience on Lee Street didn't deter him from wanting to live in Louisiana.